atheists, agnostics, long-haired weirdos, short-haired weirdos, vandals, hooligans.
The government, hug the government, love the government.
Welcome to the Politics Guys. I'm Trey Orndorff, a political scientist at Oklahoma Christian University, and I'm joined by Ken Katkin, a professor of law at Chase Law School, for our supporters exclusive show over the Federalist Papers. Ken, welcome back to the Federalist Papers.
It's great to be back. It's a bit of a delay between Federalist number 1 and Federalist number 2, but we're going to get back to it now.
Well, I mean, maybe we're embodying the spirit of Jay, right? So we're going to be dealing with Federalist Papers number 2 through 5 because they're kind of the bulk of Jay. But then he kind of drops off the map because of health and other kinds of reasons until number 64. So maybe we're just embodying that spirit. We're the Jays of the podcast. So just as regular listeners will know, it's now, man, let's see, we did that almost 2 months ago. Man, it's been a minute. But we started off, we had an overview of the Federalist Papers, and we talked about Federalist Paper number 1. And the reason we're going to deal with 2 to 5 collectively is this is Jay really talking about a singular subject of international affairs, where he's really concerned about the dangers of foreign force and influence, as he puts it. And Jay is also kind of different as a writer, Ken, because he is more of a participant here because of experience in international affairs. So he wasn't coming because of his kind of theoretical background or the fact that he had like some particular kinds of access to the grind. He was very curious because he had a background as the Secretary of Foreign Affairs under the Articles of Confederation. And so safety and the need for a national identity in the international realms, that was a big goal for him specifically. And Jay's concerns about foreign policy, I think it's unique, having reread them recently and looked at it carefully. They might very well strike the modern reader a little bit differently than they did at the time, especially his positions on like standing armies. And the other thing to remember is when we're reading this, we kind of assume the world is kind of happy about the United States coming into existence. But that's not necessarily the case. Jay's concerns, they're based on some real things going on, right? So even in 1778, French politicians are discussing, and we have these documents now with Spanish politicians about, we better be worried about this united American empire. What's going to happen here? Matter of fact, there's this one particular letter where French say we don't desire by a great deal that the rising of their new republic remains exclusively mistress of this whole immense continent. And they go on to talk about maybe we need to have some seeds of dissension in there. And Spain is even less enthusiastic about this kind of thing. They're really kind of worried about, well, are they going to move to a more unified go? And that's so in many ways, Jay kind of agrees with them. So that's kind of the starting point for some of this stuff. When you're looking at it, where do you kind of start for the Jay's papers?
Yeah, I guess we'll talk about all 4 of them, but I think number 2, which is the first of the 4, I think is mostly a lot of platitudes, and then he really gets into the meat of his arguments in numbers 3 and number 4, particularly number 4. But we could sort of lay it out like in number 2.
Yeah, start there. We'll kind of go through them sequentially that way. I was kind of trying to introduce it. So start with 2 here for us. Yeah.
Yeah, he kind of starts by just pointing out that we've got a big and diverse country. He doesn't use the same language as Madison, but Madison calls it an extended republic, and I think that's the concept that Jay is going for here. That we've got a lot of people very spread out, with different kinds of local issues and local concerns, and with a lot of resources available to them, and so he sort of puts out the idea, there's an inherent kind of tension between, on the one hand, people like to have local control and local governance and not have big government. But on the other hand, he says if you've got, this big spread out population, and you've got, a little bit of local government everywhere, then you don't necessarily have a strong enough government to really protect the national security of everybody. So yeah, so he kind of puts that out there that that's what you're kind of giving up. So I think he's kind of just sort of setting a platform for why would we ever want to strengthen the national government? Didn't we just fight off a king? Didn't we just want to, get rid of that? Isn't it nice to just have like, town meetings and local control? And don't we have so much diversity that it's gonna be better to have different kinds of governance in different kinds of places? And he says, yeah, that's all true. But don't forget, that other governments out there could be big and powerful, and we have had some experience now. He's writing this a few years after the war, after the Revolutionary War, and while we have the Articles of Confederation, and he's saying that that the kind of wise and experienced men who've actually been running the Continental Congress, they've convened from different parts of the country. They've brought with them and communicated with each other a lot of useful information, and that they're basically unity is strength is kind of what he's arguing here. That if you've got all these big diverse constituents to a greater polity, then you get from that diversity, and that if you can forge some unity, you can be strong, and that the strong country will be really best able to look after the interests of the people. So I'd say that's kind of my take on Federalist number 2. I don't know if that fully captures the way you were thinking about it as well.
No, I think that's a good start. I mean, one of the things, and you pointed out there, why now that we just fought a war, why do we want to have more strength? The other thing to keep in mind is Jay is much more a Hobbesian than he is the Lockean of, say, like a Jefferson or the Declaration of Independence. And that's one of the views of the Federalists. Early on, one of his arguments in 2 is he says, nothing is more certain than the indispensable necessity of government. Ooh, that's a pretty strong phrase. And it is equally undeniable that whenever and however it is instituted, the people must cede it to some of their natural rights in order to vest it with requisite powers. That's a very different kind of sounding starting point in 2 than what you think of, well, government's instituted to protect our rights. And here's Jay kind of sounding Hobbesian and saying, hey, we got to be careful about that. And I think you're right, as you point out, he's having a different kind of view where his point is that there's going to be some issues about peace and war that we can't handle. The bad guys are going to potentially come. That's one of the arguments. If we don't recognize this truth, it can't all be sunshine and lollipops and candy canes. War is out there.
Right. Yeah, I really like your use of Hobbesian, because he is really it's an argument that's appealing to fear more than to hope, right? That he's really saying, if Madison had, later in the Federalist Papers, Madison's going to do the thought experiment where he says, well, what kind of government would we want, if men were angels? And I think, Jay isn't using that formulation here, but it's the same idea, where he's saying, if everything in the world was all roses and lollipops, we'd probably want to have, weak local governments. And, why would we want to have a strong national government, which, potentially could infringe on individual liberty? But he's kind of saying, but there's an answer to that question. The reason we need that strong national government is because we need to maximize the ability of that government to protect us against threats, and that both the resources and, in fact, the diversity of thought that could be contributed to a national government by a national polity would make that government strong enough to protect us from threats. And so that's what justifies ceding some individual liberty. And I think he's kind of openly acknowledging that the more you strengthen a national government, the more you're necessarily ceding some individual liberty to that government. But he's saying that you're ceding a small amount of individual liberty to a government that will be able to protect all the rest of your individual liberty against various kinds of threats that might be out there.
Well, and the other bit here, and I'm glad you keep talking about, we need this national unity. He's in some way, in some ways, he is explicitly responding to anti-federalists who say, okay, I might agree with that, but who says we have to only have one? Why couldn't we have a multiplicity of Americas? Maybe, Northerners are a lot different than what we have here in the South or in the emergent West, which is not what we think of as the West today, but right. We could have these multiplicities. And Jay is really trying to forcefully answer those critics for that kind of, again, a multiplicity of Americas, and saying that states can't remain sovereign because we have a singular national identity. And he's not quite using those words. The way he puts it is he says that he's going to extol the versions of nationhood. He says, quote, "This country and this people seem to have been made for each other, and it appears as if it was the design of Providence that an inheritance so proper and convenient for a band of brethren, united to each other by the strongest ties, should never be split into a number of unsocial, jealous, and alien sovereignties," right? Because again, the other possibility here, you could go along with the Hobbesian vision, but you could still say, but hey, not every state needs to concede to this big, potentially nasty constitutional government.
Yeah, I mean, in the later papers after number 2, he also talks about the problem with 3 or 4 confederacies, that if we had 3 or 4 confederacies rather than one big federation, that almost certainly the European powers would try to, get up to some mischief and turn the 3 or 4 confederacies against each other. So, that
kind of moves us, right? That kind of moves us into 3, right? Because he kind of ends too by saying, look, quote, "The dangers that a divided United States would now face from foreign nations," is what he does. And so he starts 3, kind of recapping that and then getting us into that opinion of, okay, well, what's going to happen if we have these? So let's kind of move into 3 now. Ken.
Last thing else about 2, and then he does sort of briefly. 3, 4, and 5 are going to really be mainly about international affairs, but in 2, he mostly is also about international affairs. But he does throw in a little bit that material prosperity, that one of the things that basically we need to be protected against. He doesn't use the word, but poverty, I think, is what he's getting at here. That prosperity itself will be, which is a word he does use. Prosperity will be something that will contribute to our security, and he does argue that prosperity would be easier to maintain under a single national government, and I think that's an idea that Madison will develop in some of the later papers more than Jay does, but it's really the idea that in an extended republic, if you have national level commerce, if you have businesses that can operate on a national level and not have to be in balkanized smaller economies, they're going to get bigger and they're going to throw off more wealth. And I think he does avert to that here as well. So that I think that is consistent with the theme of Hobbesianism that you talked about, that there's a lot of threats out there. There's threats from foreign governments. There's maybe threats still from Native American Indians, and there's threats from just, poverty and failing to have a country that can develop an economy that works for people. And he's arguing that all of those threats are just better dealt with by a single national government. But then the rest is,
especially in 4 is all I was going to say. But I'm going to pause this for just a moment because that brings us to the end of our ad-supported preview. And so we've loved to have you here, and we'd love for you to continue in on this conversation about Jay's primary Federalist Papers, number 2 through 5. And if you want to have more of that, you got to become a supporter of the show. So head down to the show notes or head to politicsguys.com/support. Now, some of you are not going to be in a financial position to do that, and we understand that here at the Politics Guys. This is not a rich show. So reach out to us at mail@politicsguys.com, and we can figure something out. It's always helpful if you'll subscribe, rate, and review. That's really big. So is sharing episodes like these. Don't forget, you get all other kinds of things besides the midweek supporters show when you become a supporter. You're going to get additional shows, not just on the Federalist Papers, but from things like political ideologies with myself and with Justin. You're also going to get access to our Discord and so much more. So again, head to politicsguys.com/support or just scroll on down to the show notes. The executive producers of the Politics Guys are Wilmer Moreno, Daniel Toe, Ryan Beasley, Don Oglesby, Derek Schmidt, Dakota Heath, Jason Chrysler, Dave Dean, Jeremy Larson, Brian Matza, Jody Marie Miller, and Sean Fugit. We'll be back this weekend with a full episode. I hope you'll join us then.
This podcast is part of the Democracy Group,